Hello again, everyone. I'm Dr. George Simon, and welcome to another edition of the new Character Matters program where we talk about what I consider to be the defining issue of our time, the character crisis that we face, and has been an issue in our lives for so long now, affecting every aspect of our relationships, our community affairs, our political affairs, world affairs, and having a discussion about what it is that we need to do to turn things around. And toward that end, I've been talking about and expanding upon the principles that I first outlined in my book, Character Disturbance, called the 10 Commandments of Character. These are time-tested axioms, learning lessons that we have to master as we're growing and developing in character, to be decent folks, to be persons of genuine integrity. And I've been talking most recently about commandment number 5, which has to do with mastering one's appetites and aversions. But I want to reiterate that all of the axioms that I've been talking about, all these so-called commandments, work together. It's not necessarily that one follows the other or one is built upon the other, but they all have to be embraced in their totality to have the maximum effect. The first being that we have to come to an understanding of the bigger picture, expand our awareness, overcome our inherent egocentricity, appreciate how we're all connected and in what ways we are inextricably interconnected. And then secondly, to overcome any sense of entitlement, to cultivate some gratitude, to appreciate this magnificent gift that we have in this life with some awe and reverence. And thirdly, to develop a balanced sense of our worth, to know where our worth comes from, and to not fall into the trap of predicating our worth on people, places, or things who give us affirming messages and therefore only increase our inherent dependence, unhealthy emotional dependence. And then the commandment to have the utmost reverence for the truth, the kind of reverence that allows us to be impeccable with our own words, to speak only what we know to be genuine, to do only what we know to be genuine, and most especially when we're reckoning with ourselves, to avoid self-deception, self-deceit. For these perhaps are the greatest lies that we tell and the most damaging lies we tell. If we're to grow emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, overall in character, if we're to grow, we have to have this profound reverence for truth. It's what truly sets us free. And then we have to begin the task of mastering our appetites and aversions. We are naturally wired. Naturally so. We are naturally wired to avoid what we consider unpleasant or what pains us in some way, and to gravitate toward those things that we have either learned can bring us some pleasure or we anticipate will bring us some pleasure. We operate primarily on the pleasure principle. But folks who fall into the trap of letting their appetites and their aversions rule their lives end up in a whole heck of a lot of trouble, not just in their relationships, but internally. There is no peace for a person driven by appetites. there is no inner peace. You can never be satisfied. It's an emptiness that breeds perhaps the worst kind of depression. I know all too many folks who got into relationships because there was something about their partner that brought them joy. They had a good time. Maybe physical aspects of their relationship were just really powerful and satisfying. So they got into the relationships for those reasons. But there was nothing deeper to hold the relationship together. And eventually, when one or the other or both parties got done using one another for gratification purposes, the relationship was over. The pleasure principle that we naturally have operating within us was meant to guide us, not rule our lives. Sometimes, the things that seem very unpleasant or painful are the very things we need to do or to gravitate toward or even embrace if we're to grow. It seems counterintuitive. Likewise, some things that seem awfully appealing are the very things that we need to avoid. It takes a whole lot of mindfulness, and there again comes in the first commandment. And it takes a whole lot of reckoning with what's going on inside of ourselves. That's where growth really occurs. Yes, our relationships have the capacity to grow us in many ways, but how we really grow is through an honest self-reckoning. That's what the fourth commandment is largely about. And a part of that has to include a reckoning with this principle upon which we all operate right from the get-go. We are born in fear of life itself because we come into a cold, cruel world in our first moments, and it panics us because we've been used to a nice environment, a nice supportive, most of the time. There are tragic circumstances, unfortunately, where creatures in utero experience trauma, not denying that. But for the most part, life is good and nurturing and wholesome and pretty peaceful till we get thrust out in the world. We're not happy about it. We do our best to secure our pleasures. And as soon as we get our first taste of some comfort, we start to have some affinity for this life. But we would rather be dead, most of us, if life gets too painful. That's how allied with the pleasure principle we human beings are. And unfortunately, in our character-impaired times, too many folks are so aligned, so egregiously aligned with the pleasure principle that they engage in a whole lot of hedonistic thinking, and they adopt a hedonistic mindset. And because they have also had difficulty mastering the other commandments I've been talking about, getting outside of their inherent egocentricity, coming to appreciate their real value and where it comes from, overcoming any sense of entitlement, and having gratitude for this very gift of life, because they've had problems with all of that. They have problems getting beyond the pleasure principle. It runs their life. If they're not having a good time, what's the point in being here? If they're not getting everything they want, what's the point? If you're not satisfying me in my relationship the way I want you to, what's the point in being with you? This hedonistic mindset is destroying us. And it's rampant. It's rampant. We have a whole lot, more than many generations throughout history. And we're used to it. We feel entitled to it. And it's a soul killer because we can get stuck operating on that singular plane, that singular hedonistic plane. We can get so stuck that we don't evolve in character, that we don't move beyond that. That instead of the pleasure principle being a guide for us in life, it becomes the ruler of us. And in the process, a bigger, richer, fuller life evades us. I can't say this enough. Years and years and years of counseling experience have demonstrated to me the truth of these axioms that I'm trying to impart, and that I'm finishing up a book about, but that you can still get some insight into in my book, Character Disturbance. You know, I really need to say a few words about character disturbance once again, because the book did not have the grab appeal of my first book, In Sheep's Clothing, which was the very first book to capture the syndrome we now call the gaslighting syndrome, that crazy-making feeling of knowing that you're in a relationship with somebody who is not right in character. But when you either call them on their tactics or call them on some aspects of their behavior that confirm your suspicions in some way, the way they respond and the tactics they use has you thinking that there's something wrong with you, that you're crazy for thinking the way you did. So In Sheep's Clothing had some natural appeal because even though we didn't have a name for it then, a label commonly used for it, it described the syndrome and it resonated with people all over the world. But character disturbance is a much more thorough examination of the phenomenon of our age. Character dysfunction exists along a spectrum. There are still too many folks that don't appreciate this. Character disturbances of various types, such as narcissism, exist along a spectrum, spectra of type and degree. There are some forms of narcissism, for example, that appear relatively benign and will trap you into a relationship. And you don't realize how toxic the relationship is until it's too late. Some amiable narcissists, for example, have the capacity for great charm. They have great seductive power. You can be swayed. You don't find out how inherently self-centered they are and how prone they are to abuse and exploit you until later on. Some forms of narcissism are inherently revolting because they're vulgar, banal. The person acts in a haughty and grandiose manner that is so egregious that it's an immediate turnoff. There's a spectrum of character disturbance, and not all of manifestations of it look alike, and not all manifestations of character dysfunction are inherently a turnoff. This is what hooks so many people into problem relationships. The character disturbance is a very serious study of all the character dysfunction out there, and it's the only book that can help acquaint you with the kind of help that you're inevitably going to need as you're trying to recover from a toxic relationship or relationship you once thought was solidly built but proved to be toxic. Too many folks experience the phenomenon we call therapy-induced trauma, where they finally got their disturbed relationship partner, cajoled them into some kind of counseling, only to feel worse for the effort, for a wide variety of reasons. Whether it's because the disturbed character had that incredible capacity for charm and seduction and somehow snowed the counselor, or just the mere fact that the perspective of the counselor, who didn't adequately consider the fact that even though everyone in every relationship has their set of problems, on balance, when a fairly decent person is in a relationship with a disturbed character, much more serious attention has to be given to the character disturbance. It's not equal. The problems that basically decent folks have with their inner emotional conflicts pale in comparison to the damage that occurs within a relationship with someone who has serious character flaws. Very few therapists understand this and know how to deal with it. So in my book, Character Disturbance, I outline what the right kind of therapy looks like for the benefit of both counselors who might be reading the material, as well as individuals who might be seeking help. And I revisit those same issues in my book, How Did We End Up Here? We live in trying times, character disturbed times. And as I mentioned before, and have mentioned many times, we have to come to appreciate the broad spectrum that there is of character dysfunction. These days, when it comes to certain character traits, such as narcissism, almost everybody's an expert and almost everybody's got something to say. I have to tell you, there's a whole lot of misinformation out there. The spectrum is broader and wider than most folks will tell you. And you cannot adopt the perspective that many folks advance these days, that there are just general rules, ways to tell. Almost everybody writing about these things has an experience with a certain type of narcissism and then overgeneralizes it. So I digress just a little bit, but it was important for me to kind of put all these things together. But to get back to the subject at hand today, and that I'll be continuing to discuss in the next couple of Character Matters programs. In our hedonistic times, most of the internal pain, disquiet, and deadness that we feel, the emptiness that so many folks struggle with, has to do with the fact that we have been so indulged and have come to expect our pleasures. And we don't know how to deal with hardship. We don't know how to deal properly with pain. We naturally tend to gravitate toward the things that will please us, but some things that please us immensely are still no good for us. We have to have more mindfulness than that. We have to have more love for ourselves than that. But sadly, we live in incredibly hedonistic times, and sadly, too many folks take far too long to outgrow their hedonistic mindsets. We want what makes us, or we think what makes us happy. We want what pleases us, brings us some degree of satisfaction, and we don't want to suffer. But for the person who's really alive and who can find real meaning and joy, there are some things that are a turn on that should be avoided like the plague, and some things that are inherently distasteful that need to be embraced. You know, one of the things I realized in dealing with disturbed characters had to do with the primary motivation behind their resistance to change. In classical psychology paradigms, a person doesn't want to admit their shortcomings and do anything about them because it's too painful to admit them, and they don't, and they unconsciously basically defend against the realization. But what I found in my work is that even the most seriously disturbed characters know what's going on and what's unhealthy and what probably needs to change. But they don't have a heart for the work that it takes to change and grow. And that, my friends, that willingness to do that kind of work is what defines love. Not the sentiment of love, but the real deal. Genuine love is labor on behalf of something bigger. Whether it's growing yourself or helping another person who you care about to grow. Real love is sacrifice, as all the great mystical and religious traditions have tried to tell us. Without true sacrifice, there is no love. Now, self-martyrdom is another story. We're not called to be masochists. We're not called to endure ridiculous, unnecessary mistreatment at the hands of anyone, let alone ourselves. It's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the willingness that it takes to grow and be better, and to even begin to have the right attitude toward that. You have to have already mastered the first commandment, which is to have embraced that bigger picture, to have overcome that inherent egocentricity, to appreciate the fact that it's not all about me, that there's something bigger to which we're all called into a relationship. I'll have more to say about that in some future episodes. So let me see if I can wrap things up here for today. I mentioned before that all of these life axioms, these important lessons that I call the 10 Commandments, they all work together. They all build upon one another. There's no particular order to them, but they are meant to be embraced in totality. And they complement each other. But the one that I've been talking about presently and the next two that will follow particularly work together. This one that I've been talking about having to do with overcoming our natural hedonistic tendencies and learning to be the master of our appetites and aversions, our likes and our dislikes. And the next one having to do with thinking before acting, being a master of our impulses, not letting our impulses drive us, but letting our mindfulness guide our actions. And then the seventh commandment that we'll be talking about, having to do with forming a strong but rightly purposed will, training ourselves to be properly willful. And these three, the fifth, sixth, and seventh so-called commandments, work together to help us build a strong and rightly guided conscience. Conscience formation these days doesn't get enough attention. It's one of the crucial aspects of our character being that moral and ethical side of our personality anyway. Our personality defines our general approach to life. Our character defines how conscientiously we approach life. And when we have a mature, well-formed conscience, we push ourselves to do the things that are difficult, but that ultimately are for our own betterment and the betterment of all. And we hold ourselves back from those things that seem really tempting, but will do us and others great disservice if we indulge in them. And then also, if we're developing a proper conscience, we learn how to be mindful of our actions and their impact, and we think before we act, and we deliberate with principle. We take the time to discern what the prudent action would be. And then lastly, we have the strength of will to either resist the tempting but toxic, or to make ourselves do the difficult, but ultimately rewarding and beneficial. So this commandment that I've been talking about and the subsequent two all work together. They complement one another to help us form the kind of conscience that will guide us through life and help us live and love in better harmony with ourselves and with each other. So we'll keep talking about these things. And I invite you, of course, once again, to avail yourself of the abundant material on my blog at drgeorgesimon.com. That's www.drgeorgesimon.com. And if you need to contact me for any reason, you can go to the contact page on the blog as well. The contact feature has just been improved. Some folks were having difficulty setting up consultations. I think that has been resolved. If you still have difficulty, you can certainly email me and I'll be glad to look into it. But it looks like that issue has been solved. But at any rate, you can avail yourself of the hundreds of timely articles that should prove beneficial to you. And I'll have an announcement in just a couple of weeks about the tentative release date for my upcoming book, tentatively titled Essentials for the Journey, Embracing and Living the 10 Commandments of Character. So until next time, thanks for tuning in, and be sure to tune in again next time for another edition of the new Character Matters. I'm Dr. George Simon. Take care.